Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Nice to be with you in person and those watching virtually. It's nice to be back in the Commonwealth Club, in person, seeing each other face to face, mask to mask. Thank you very much for being with us. Good evening and welcome to today's in-person and virtual program of the Commonwealth Club of California featuring U.S. Congresswoman Liz Cheney. I'm Dan Ashley, news anchor of ABC 7 Television in San Francisco and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors, and proud to be your moderator for tonight's program. This program is part of the Commonwealth Club's Future of Democracy series, supported by Betsy and Roy Eisenhart, and we know that you will enjoy our discussion tonight. Now I am very pleased to introduce today's guest, Liz Cheney, Congresswoman from Wyoming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Liz Cheney serves as Wyoming's lone member of Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives. She was first elected in 2016 on a platform of restoring America's strength and power in the world and pursuing conservative solutions to create jobs, cut taxes and regulation, as well as expand America's energy, mining, and agriculture industries. As a prominent Republican, Representative Cheney made national headlines, of course, earlier this year when she voted to impeach President Trump, saying he provoked the January 6th Capitol attack. She has also vowed to fight to keep President Trump out of office if he runs again, and has challenged all assertions by President Trump and his supporters that the 2020 election was fraudulent and stolen. This led to her removal as chair of the House Republican Conference, where she was the third-ranking Republican. She was recently appointed by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to serve on the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. In a Washington Post opinion column published this past May, Representative Cheney wrote, "The Republican Party is at a turning point, and Republicans must decide whether we are going to choose truth and fidelity to the Constitution," end quote. She went on to write, "History is watching. Our children are watching. We must be brave enough to defend the basic principles that underpin and protect our freedom and our democratic process. I am committed to doing that no matter what the short-term political consequences might be," end quote. So today we're going to have a conversation about the outlook for American democracy and many other things as well. Please once again welcome Representative Liz Cheney.
Thank you.
And I'm going to encourage all of you, there's cards at the ready to send questions up when you have them, and I'll try to get to them. And when you see me looking at my phone, I'm not doing social media, I'm not texting friends, I'm not bored. I'm responding to text questions that they will send me from our virtual audiences. So not to worry. Great to be with you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's begin with the cost. As I said in the introduction, your stance on President Trump. Let's begin with the cost, political and personal, of standing up against the president and your party as you did. Describe the consequences of that.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club. I suppose I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the cost or the consequences. I really do think that where we are as a country and where we are as a party is at a really perilous moment. And I think that when you look at what happened on January 6th, when you look at what former President Trump did in the lead up to the 6th, what he did in failing to send help while the Capitol was under attack, and what he's continued to do since, he's demonstrated that he is willing to sort of roll through any guardrail of democracy. And I think that is very dangerous. And I think that all of us as Americans, and those of us especially who are elected and who have taken an oath under God to the Constitution, have a responsibility and an obligation to protect the Republic and to protect the peaceful transfer of power.
So many of your colleagues, Congresswoman, chose not to do that. Republican colleagues, they didn't take that same stand. Why do you think that was the case? And was it worth it to you politically and personally to take that stand?
Well, look, I think that we're at an unprecedented moment, and I think that there were members who made political calculations instead of taking a step back and saying, the Republic only functions if we are faithful to the Constitution. And so, from my perspective, it wasn't a choice. There is no choice because of the gravity of what happened. And it was a very near-run thing. The attempt to delay the count and the violence, of course, itself. It didn't work. It didn't work. People sometimes say, well, our institutions held that day. And they did. But institutions don't defend themselves. And they held because of a lot of brave people, people at the local level who refused to yield when former President Trump, called them and said, just find me some votes. It held because Vice President Trump or Vice President Pence refused to reject slates of electors. But it depends on, the institutions depend upon people defending them.
Before we go any further, just because you were there that day on the 6th, describe your experience in the Capitol as rioters began to storm the building.
I was on the floor, and we were in the process of debating the electoral votes, and the security, Secret Service details or Capitol Police details came onto the floor and evacuated, the speaker and some of the other leaders on both sides who happened to be on the floor. But many of us, were there, stayed, and it was something you never think you can't even imagine it's going to happen. I mean, we could hear the mob approaching. We kept getting announcements from Capitol Police, going up to the speaker's chair and announcing, that the mob had breached the Capitol, the mob was in the rotunda, the tear gas had been released.
What was going through your mind at that?
It just was surreal, and I was angry. But we were following instructions. They told us to get gas masks out from under the chairs and begin to put them on.
And you did that?
I got it out. I didn't put mine on. There was many people sort of opened them up and waited to see whether or not we needed.
When you say you were angry, what made you angry?
I was angry because, this is the United States of America, and the Congress was in the process of conducting one of our constitutional responsibilities, which is to count the electoral votes and certify the winner of the presidential election. And the notion that we had, a violent mob that had invaded the Capitol was just, you couldn't believe it.
Does it, in the aftermath of that and what happened in terms of President Trump trying to nullify and discredit the election, do you feel that some of your Republican colleagues should be embarrassed by their behavior, even ashamed of by what they did do or did not do?
Absolutely. When you are entrusted with the responsibilities that we have, and look, if you look at what just about everybody said immediately after the attack, people knew at that moment, on the 6th and the 7th and up until, many days after, what had happened and how dangerous it was and how wrong it was. And so then to have many of those same people, Kevin McCarthy, for example, the Republican leader, decide that he's going to go to Mar-a-Lago before the month is out to essentially rehabilitate the most dangerous president in American history. I don't have an explanation for that, but it is certainly something that he should be ashamed of.
Perhaps it hasn't been hard because you are obviously doing what you think is right, but you really have taken a very vocal stand against some of your Republican colleagues. That has been isolating, I would suspect, for you in Congress. Am I right?
Well, again, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that because what matters is the future of the country, and what matters is the future of the party. I am a Republican. The first person I ever voted for was Ronald Reagan. I'm a conservative Republican, and I believe that our party has to be based on truth. And I believe that the majority of Republicans across this country know that, and that we have to decide as a party if we're going to be back in a position where we're winning elections. We have to be able to convey to people we believe in the truth, we believe in the Constitution, we're going to conduct ourselves in a way that's serious and responsible. I'm committed to making sure that that's the direction we go in.
And we're going to leave this topic in just a moment, Congresswoman, but what did you think as you heard the president and others try to discredit this election? You never believed, or did you, that Joe Biden didn't win the election fair and square?
I did not believe that he lost. I knew that Joe Biden had won
The election.
Yes.
When you heard the rhetoric otherwise, what did you think from your Republican colleagues in leadership positions and the president?
Well,
that act?
we went through a process. So after the election itself, the president had every right to bring legal challenges. We have a process to do that. Either candidate could have done it. The president did that, and he had a right to do it. But once you get to the point where over 60 judges have said there's no merit to these claims, then there's a moment, and particularly once the Electoral College has met, then it becomes very dangerous for a president of the United States to reject the rulings of the courts. And it's one thing to disagree with court rulings. I happen to think, for example, that Justice Roberts got it wrong on Obamacare. And our First Amendment rights give us the protection to say that. But you don't get to ignore the rulings. And that is what President Trump was doing. And so as we watched after the certification, the continued claims, the continued efforts to try to delay, the continued efforts to pressure local officials, that took us into territory we had never been in before. And when you have the president saying the same things about our process, that it doesn't work, that it can't convey the will of the people, the same things, for example, that the Chinese government says about democracy, people really need to stop and think about what he did and what he continues to do and why that's so dangerous.
Well, you believe, as many do, that President Trump inspired and ignited the rage that led to the Capitol riot. Beyond his role, more broadly, what is happening in the country that makes this really, as you said, once unthinkable act even possible? How could we possibly get to this point where hundreds of Americans would storm the American Capitol?
Well, I think there's a lot going on in the country, but I think that his actions, and if you look, for example, just at what the defendants are saying now, we've had something like 600 charged, and if you look at their pleadings, many of them say, well, we were there because President Trump told us to come. And so I think there clearly was a provocation. I think that one of the really important things the Select Committee has to do is understand more about the planning that went on, understand more about the financing of the effort. And I think it's also clear, if you look at many of the videos that have been out there publicly, that there were organized, paramilitary groups within those who breached the Capitol. And I think we need to understand exactly what those connections are and how that happened.
All right. Congresswoman, besides what happened at the Capitol, and we are going to move on from that, what would you identify as Donald Trump's greatest failure as president?
Well, nothing comes close to, what he did in terms of, attempting to steal the election. But I do think that he had some good policies. I think that what he did with respect to tax policy was good. I think what he did with respect to deregulation was good. So there were good policies. What he did to fund the military was good. But I think, for what we're seeing today, for example, in Afghanistan, Joe Biden bears responsibility for the decision, which has led directly to this just catastrophe. But President Trump said all along he wanted to withdraw our forces, and he, instructed Secretary of State Pompeo and others to negotiate with the Taliban. And so I think, that certainly is something that you have to point to say, that setting the United States down the path where we're negotiating with terrorists, where we've made concessions to the terrorists, we, basically committed that we would have 5,000 prisoners released in Afghanistan, completely sidelined the Afghan government, and set us on the path that led to what we're seeing today. And so I think certainly that's a failing. And I think the management of COVID is a failing.
It's a failing. And you answered actually my next question, which was on the other side of that question, what do you think was his greatest success as president? And you pointed to a few things that you believe he did quite well.
Yeah, and I think if you look at, in particular, the funding of the Defense Department, we live in a world that is full of an array of threats that the velocity of the threats, the number of them, it's a very dangerous world, and the danger is accelerating. And his commitment to provide the resources necessary for several years for the Defense Department to begin to do what's necessary to meet those threats, I think was a very important policy.
And I do want to turn my next area of conversation here is Afghanistan. But before that, let me button this with one of the questions from a member of the audience. And I'll paraphrase it a little bit for the purpose of this conversation. Going back to the election and the claims that it was illegitimate, they won by a landslide, as he said, which we knew not to be the case. There are still a great number of people in the public. I don't know how many lawmakers really believe that, but the public believes, number of Republican faithful, that is the case, that he did in fact win the election and that Joe Biden somehow stole the election. How do you and the Republican leadership push back against that notion and make it clear to members of the party and party supporters that this was a legitimate election so that we don't have this dangerous cycle happening every 4 years?
Well, I think that part of it comes with having leaders of my party recognize they aren't bystanders. And, too often what's happening today is you have party leaders on the Republican side who know that it wasn't stolen. They know that what Donald Trump is saying is not true, but they go along with it. And that, that's a dereliction of their duty, because, we aren't bystanders. We have the responsibility and the ability to help educate the public, and to make sure that people understand the facts. And I think actually it's one of the really important things the Select Committee has to do, which is walk through the different aspects of the lie about the election and help people to understand and recognize that these claims are just not true. It doesn't mean that there wasn't fraud, but there was not sufficient fraud to have changed the outcome, and the courts have decided that.
And there's fraud to some degree in every election.
Right.
Sure. And this is one of those moments that I'm looking at my phone. So,
or I've just bored you already.
Not at all. Just making sure I don't leave anyone out. Let's turn now, Congresswoman, to Afghanistan. The images we've seen in the last couple of days of Afghans running on the tarmac, trying to get on airplanes, obviously heartbreaking, and certainly for many of the men and women who served in Afghanistan, infuriating to some degree. Why did it happen?
Yeah. I think there are a number of reasons. I think, first of all, allowing our policy to be set around political slogans is extremely dangerous. And so we've had now 3 presidents, essentially, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, all of whom said, oh, we have to end the endless wars. 2,500 forces on the ground in Afghanistan to prevent the Taliban from being able to do what they've now done, to prevent safe havens that the Taliban, who, by the way, never has renounced al-Qaeda. In fact, the leader of the Taliban swears allegiance to the leader of al-Qaeda. Anybody who tells you that the Taliban renounced al-Qaeda or that they ever agreed to renounce al-Qaeda is just not true. And so we should have done a better job, our leaders should have done a better job at explaining to the American people why we need troops deployed, why they're important for our counterterrorism efforts, for our counterintelligence efforts. The notion that you're going to simply announce we're withdrawing was wrong. I think it reflects a misunderstanding about America's role in the world. And again, what we were able to accomplish with a relatively small force was certainly an important element of our security. And when you look at what's happened today, it is heartbreaking. And on top of the fact that the policy of withdrawal was wrong, certainly the way that it's done is indefensible. And I just saw before I came that there's been this announcement sent out to Americans in Kabul, get yourselves to the airport and we'll get you out. But the U.S. military cannot protect you getting to the airport. Now that is absolutely stunning and unacceptable. And President Biden's speech yesterday, in my view, was appalling. For somebody who told the American people that he was an expert on foreign policy and told the American people that he was compassionate, that speech was blaming everybody else, showed no understanding of the reality of what's happening on the ground, and was not the kind of speech that the leader of the United States of America should ever give.
Well, President Biden said yesterday, as you well know, that he was surprised, that even he was surprised at how rapidly the Taliban was able to overrun the country. Should he have been surprised? Did we know that this was a very real possibility?
He should not have been surprised, and he should have listened to the military advice that I'm confident he was receiving. I think he ignored that. And the consequences are grave, not just for what it means for us in terms of our security and our ability to defend ourselves from Islamic terrorism, which, now we have to undertake an entirely new and expanded effort to do that because they will have a caliphate. What it means for us globally, who is going to trust the United States watching the footage that we're seeing now out of the Kabul airport? And what it means in terms of the way that we have empowered our adversaries. It's going to be something that will take concerted effort to recover from, and he should have listened to his military advisors.
Speaking of surreal, you mentioned the scene at the Capitol when it was being attacked. A surreal scene I thought today was when the Taliban held a news conference for world media, and they pledged to not seek reprisals against those who supported Americans, to allow Americans to leave. Do you believe any of that?
No, of course not. And this was one of the problems of the last several years. And we have now seen, since the devastation that is on our televisions all across the country about Afghanistan, attempts by people in the Trump administration to sort of rewrite the history on this. And I think that is also wrong, because this has been such a devastating event that as a country we have to make sure we learn the right lesson from it. At the time that Secretary Pompeo was meeting with Taliban leaders, was negotiating with them, there were many of us who were saying, you cannot negotiate with terrorists. And the document that some now are claiming was some sort of real agreement was a surrender document. And the idea that the Taliban was ever, going to provide for U.S. security or not provide safe haven to terrorists is just not true. And I think it's important for us going forward to learn the lesson of what happened here in a way that is fact-based.
Not true, and some would say ludicrous on the face of it.
Right.
You know, how could this crisis have been avoided? Do we stay, or could we have gotten out in a way that did not create this current crisis? What could President Biden have done differently? What could President Trump have done differently to lead up to this moment? What should Biden have done?
He should have stayed. And
But for how long? When does it end?
well, I mean, if you look at U.S. forces deployed in Germany, U.S. forces deployed in Korea, we have to really look at the facts of what was happening on the ground. 2,500 forces. We were working with the Afghans. We had trained the Afghans. The Afghan army was doing the majority of the fighting, but they had our air support, and they had our ISR. They were in a position where we were able to prevent the takeover of the country. We were able to slow and stop the establishment of safe havens. We had intelligence operations we were able to conduct. And the idea that you go from that status quo to this disaster as a matter of a policy decision is indefensible. Not to mention what's happening now. Pakistan is on the border, obviously. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. We've created a completely unstable situation. You're going to have Afghan refugees, certainly contributing to instability in Pakistan, which is very dangerous. So at every single moment here, the impact of this decision is going to be grave and in some cases catastrophic. And
So we should not have withdrawn these troops.
we shouldn't have withdrawn the troops, and we shouldn't. You don't say, well, we're going to defend American security for 20 years, and that's it. And you don't end wars by leaving. What's happened is that the terrorists have won in Afghanistan. And so that's not ending wars. And that's something, President Obama talked about, I'm going to end wars. And we saw what happened in Iraq. The withdrawal from Iraq led ultimately to the establishment of the caliphate that we then had to go back in and defeat. So it's important for us to understand what those forces are doing and why they need to be there.
Congresswoman, something like $1 trillion spent in Afghanistan, 80-something billion spent on training Taliban forces, all to no avail.
Training Afghan
Fighters,
Yeah,
all to no avail, as we've seen. As soon as we remove our troops, the whole thing collapses. Was this doomed from the start?
No, and I would disagree that it was to no avail. I think if you look at, we went into Afghanistan, obviously after 9/11, and it's important to remember that before we invaded Afghanistan, we said to the Taliban, give up al-Qaeda and we will not come in.
Right.
And that should have been a lesson. If the Taliban wasn't willing to give up al-Qaeda facing the kind of military action that they faced, the notion that something else was going to incentivize them to do it is just not right. But we have to recognize, and the way I look at it is there's one question, and the question is, what does our security require? And if you determine, as I think is right, that U.S. security requires that the terrorists can't establish safe havens, then you have to determine, all right, what is it going to take in terms of our activities on the ground to prevent that? And it is not fair to say, and it is actually, I think, shameful to say the Afghans aren't fighting. The Afghans fought alongside us for 20 years. They took the vast bulk of the casualties. And they were able to do that in part because we were providing air support. We were providing training. We were providing weapons. And, once you pull that away and you create a situation where America seems like we're departing and washing our hands of the situation, it's not a surprise that we would be where we are today. But it is tragic.
Well, and I guess I use the phrase to no avail because I wonder how the history books will judge the time spent in Afghanistan, given how we just left. We may have to go back in, who knows, but how we just left. And what do we show for it other than of course, getting bin Laden many, many years ago.
Well-
How will history judge this episode?
I think it's very important that history recognize that, after 9/11, we've now gone 20 years without a mass casualty attack launched from Afghanistan. And every American and allied service member who fought in Afghanistan needs to know that that is an important, hugely important element of keeping us safe, and that what they did is something that we are all grateful for. And so, having our forces deployed there kept us safe. Now that they aren't there, the cost of defending the nation is going to increase.
And the risk will increase as
And
well.
the threat will increase, yeah.
We've heard today from a number of service men and women who were there. Some came back wounded, some did not, who are very frustrated, angry, heartbroken about what they're seeing because they served there. They worked alongside the Afghan fighters and the Afghan people, and they are sickened by the images that they're seeing, and they feel that we as a country have abandoned the Afghan people. What would you say to them?
We have abandoned the Afghan people. I think that the fact that we did not put in place, apparently, the planning to be able to evacuate American citizens. We didn't put in place the planning to be able to evacuate Afghans who worked with us.
Which we could have done weeks ago, right, leading up to this.
Yes, and there will be, I'm confident, many investigations into what happened. The fact that we turned over Bagram Air Base and now are trying to evacuate people from, Karzai International Airport. Those things will. People will have to explain why that happened. But the bottom line of abandoning the Afghans when they were fighting with us and we gave them a commitment, and think about the Afghan women. I mean, that is absolutely heartbreaking. When I see people today saying things like, well, maybe the Taliban is going to be a new and improved Taliban. It is, it's just wrong. If anything, the Taliban will be stronger than they were before, better
Having
organized,
survived
better
this.
fight it, and being able to claim this tremendous victory against us. So I think that this will go down as one of the worst and most dangerous foreign policy decisions potentially in the history of the country.
That's a big statement. Are you worried about the human rights violations that are likely to come against women and others?
Oh, I mean, we're seeing them already. I mean, it is, when you have Afghan women who, we worked with and encouraged and who demonstrated unbelievable strength and commitment to rebuilding their nation and their society, and now they're being raped, they're being forced, into these relationships, raped by the Taliban fighters, killed, tortured. It is, and then for President Biden to have made the decision that has caused this, and then for him to stand up and say, listen, we're going to continue to speak out for the Afghan women. I mean, that is really, really cynical and disingenuous.
In the days, weeks, months, even years that follow, what must we do in Afghanistan now? What is our path forward?
Well, I think several things. One is the Biden administration has got to put together a strategy that is a very clear strategy for how we are going to ensure we're not attacked again. This has fundamentally changed all of the calculations about how do we protect the United States from terrorist attacks. And one of the things that hasn't gotten a lot of attention is all of the prisoners that have been released from Afghan prisons over the last 72 hours or so, and the ones that were released before under the Trump agreement, they are populating not only terrorist activity inside Afghanistan, but terrorist organizations globally. And so they will. And so I think it clearly, as you've seen the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and others say, has increased the threat to the United States. So the Biden administration, number one, they have to get the people out. They have to get the Americans out, and they have to get the Afghans out who helped us. That's got to be number one. And number two, they've got to make sure that they're putting in place a plan that reflects the increased resources, the increased focus and attention it's now going to take to protect us.
Can you see a situation where we go back in?
Look, I think it's very hard to imagine at this moment, but I think that the Biden administration has to take a very hard look at what's necessary. I mean, the idea that we have let this happen, and it could have been avoided with the status quo, that's something they will have to answer for.
All right. Let's turn our attention now to the coronavirus. The United States seemingly caught on its heels at the start of the pandemic and slow to fully respond. Now the Delta variant is once again, as we know, filling our hospitals. Could this have been avoided, and how?
Well, yes, and I think the Chinese government bears direct responsibility. And one of the facts that I think tells you the responsibility that they bear, and there are discussions about, did it come from the lab? Did it come from the wet market? I think it looks increasingly like it came from the lab. But the fact that the Chinese government stopped all travel from Wuhan province to the rest of the rest of China, so they said you can't come into the rest of China if you're in Wuhan, but they allowed travel into the rest of the world. That act alone is the spread of this virus, because they clearly understood they had human-to-human transmission. They were trying to protect themselves, but they unleashed it on the rest of the world. And the economic consequences, the consequences in terms of lost lives, all of those things are the direct result of the fact that the government of China unleashed this virus on the world.
So what do we learn from that? How do we protect the world, not just this, from this happening again? What's the lesson learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think several things. I think, one, we have to be clear-eyed about the responsibility of the government of China. I think the world has to be. I think, I support the notion that they need to pay restitution. I think that the consequences of this, we all are vaccinated. We're all, likely going to have to get shots on a regular basis, probably. We don't know what kinds of variants and mutations you're going to see of the virus, but we're going to be living with this probably for the rest of our lives. And that is a circumstance that I think they've got to be held responsible for. I think it also...
Is that going to happen? Will they be held responsible?
Well, I think there are a number of ways that it needs to happen. I think one is, countries around the world need to recognize the danger that they pose, and that has to affect where supply chains are. It needs to affect, where we produce pharmaceuticals in the United States and where those supply chains are. It needs to, as we're going into this next phase of sort of the great power competition, I think that the fact of their unleashing of this virus should be a very clear lesson for people about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, the nature of the government of China. And when you think about things like, those who say America should withdraw from the world, people that have the Rand Paul view of the world, for example, don't understand that if we withdraw, there's a vacuum that is filled, and that vacuum is filled by China. It's filled by Russia. It's filled by people who do not share our views of the world. They don't share our views about democracy. And you really do have to ask yourself, do you want to live in that world? But we need to be able to build allies and bring them together around standing up against a global surveillance state, which is the Chinese model here.
But of course, the next pandemic may well not come from China or even that part of the world. And clearly this last 15, 16 months has made us very aware of our vulnerability to the potential. Something perhaps, given our modern way of living in modern science, we took for granted that this could really happen. The next virus could be far worse.
Yeah.
What are the lessons learned for us?
Well, I think there are some lessons learned that are good ones. If you look at the fact that the United States was able, through Operation Warp Speed, which was another policy of the Trump administration that was a really good one, to develop vaccines in a relatively short period of time. The fact that we have been able to respond to it, I think, is important. But I think we need to make sure that we're doing everything possible to provide the resources to NIH, to the CDC, so that we are protecting ourselves. And I think we need to think through the vulnerabilities and what's necessary to respond when you have a power like China willing to unleash this kind of death on a global scale.
From the start, President Trump downplayed the severity of the coming pandemic. What would you say to governors like Greg Abbott of Texas, who, as we know, just tested positive for COVID himself, asymptomatic? We certainly wish him well. But Ron DeSantis of Florida, who continue to resist mandatory masking and other pandemic safety measures. What would you say to those leaders, Republican leaders, who have not embraced some of the mandatory masking, mandatory vaccinations, and those two states particularly seeing huge spikes in coronavirus cases? As a fellow Republican, what would you say to them?
I think this never should have become political. And I do think President Trump bears responsibility for the fact that it did become political. And I think that decisions going forward, I think those decisions have to be made based on what, the best public health information is at the time. And so, if you have, local school districts, for example, that believe that they have to mask in order for kids to be back in person, those decisions should be made based on health. So I think there's a whole series of decisions around masking, decisions around vaccinations that we have to do everything we can to get the politics out of. At the same time, I think we as a society are going to be dealing with the consequences of kids not being in school. And those are very real. And I don't think we know the full cost of that. And so when you look at, many kids have been out of school for over a year. And that is the cost of that in terms of education, the cost in terms of, mental health, I think are very real. And I think we need to be thinking through how we're going to address that and address those issues. But, issues around public health ought to be made based upon, medical advice and medical guidance and not politics.
What would you attribute, you mentioned President Trump, but beyond that, just as a culture, what has happened where science has become so politicized, and that we, as someone said recently, that we don't debate reality as much as policy anymore? What has changed in this country from your perspective?
I think that we, in many ways, have sort of lost a common set of facts, not just about science, but about many things. And some of that is because of social media. Some of it is because of the algorithms those social media companies use that just sort of drive people to more and more radical places to get more and more likes and clicks. And we need to think through how we get back to a place where we can debate facts and we can say we have different perspectives on what the solutions might be. But it's very difficult and challenging if you're in a situation that's sort of post-truth. And I think the combination of people being at home so much, having so much time on the internet, the algorithms that are being used on the internet, the siloing of information. And look, we see this. I think Fox News does it. I think MSNBC does it. They don't want people changing the channel, so you sort of, tell them what they want to hear. And that means that there is no longer a set of basic, recognizable facts we can, base our movement forward on.
And I have my facts and someone else has their facts, and never the two shall meet,
Yeah.
really. Let's turn now to another topic that we are increasingly concerned about. And that is climate change. Hundreds of thousands of acres are once again on fire in California as we face another devastating wildfire season, exacerbated, most experts say, by human activity. From a policy standpoint, what do we do as a state and a country? What do we need to? How do we need to address the concerns of climate change in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think this is another issue that we really need to get the politics out of. And so, if you look at the forest fires, for example, one of the things that I know we face in Wyoming, and we face across the country, is bad forest management. And years where we have not had the timber sales that we've needed to have at the numbers we've needed. We haven't had the ability, we've had things like the roadless rule. When you combine the roadless rule with the beetle kill that we've seen in some of our national forests, you end up with, dead trees that nobody is allowed to go in and clear out. And so the forest fires are a direct result of those bad management policies. I think, one thing we do need to look at is look at the last year and a half. And because of COVID, clearly, and I haven't looked at the numbers, but I would imagine that, emissions were down because people were not driving, they weren't out, they were in their homes.
That is true, actually.
So
Pollution was down.
So you had a year and a half where carbon emissions are down, and it would be interesting to see, well, did the temperature decrease as well? And it didn't. So recognizing and understanding policies that you want to put in place and making sure those policies have a direct impact on what you're trying to do. So if the purpose is we have to deal with global warming, then I think it's incumbent upon us to say, all right, what policies really work? And too often what we've seen in Wyoming, for example, is policies that are put in place from Washington that are incredibly damaging to our economy, but don't actually affect ultimately global temperature. So, you have a situation, for example, in Wyoming, we are doing really interesting and innovative work on carbon capture and carbon sequestration. And some of the proposals on what to do about the environment that come from the far left basically ignore all of that. We just have to move completely beyond fossil fuels, which is not realistic. And I think we need to recognize progress that's being made and come together to find solutions that actually are solutions.
A small but growing number of Republican leaders have started more publicly to acknowledge that global warming and climate change is an issue and that it has been exacerbated by human activity. But there is great, and you alluded to it a moment ago, great disagreement as to what to do about it. And there's real reluctance to dramatically change our reliance on fossil fuels. Do you think we, at some point, need to dramatically change our reliance on fossil fuels?
I think that we need to recognize that fossil fuels are fundamental to running the economy, and that we have made huge strides at being able to get access to those fossil fuels and being able to use them in ways that have less impact on the environment. And I think that's very important. In Wyoming, we also have wind energy. We now going to be the site of a new nuclear facility. And I think that's all important. But I think we have to be realistic. Wind energy is important, but wind energy, if you're worried about the view shed, when you drive between Laramie and Cheyenne and you look out, you don't just see beautiful prairie anymore. You see an awful lot of turbines. Mm-hmm. And those turbines have a very negative impact, for example, on our eagle population, on our birds generally. And what do you do when the turbines break? Where do you put them? You end up with landfills full of turbines. So there are consequences to all of these decisions, and I think it's really important for us to say, what are we trying to accomplish? Let's do things that actually accomplish it, not just things that maybe make us feel better, and ultimately don't contribute to improving the environment.
You say that fossil fuels are fundamental to our economy, and surely they are. Do they have to remain that way in the decades to come? Can we, or should we, and I ask the question openly, ultimately move away from fossil fuels?
Look, I don't believe that we should. I think that, my view is those fossil fuels are actually a national treasure, and that we have been able to provide reliable and affordable electricity, to do it in a way that really does reflect how important it is to be good stewards of the environment, and it has improved significantly. So, if you come to Wyoming, and I'll take you to show you land that's been reclaimed from, our coal mines, for example. The land is in much better condition in some circumstances than it was prior to the mining. And so, again, I think it's about, let's be honest about what we're able to do. Let's be honest about the way that we have been able to now get access to oil and gas in a way that makes us energy independent. I mean, if you're talking about national security threats, foreign adversaries, would like nothing more, for example, than to be able to, shut down our grid, to be able to make our grid not reliable. And, we've had challenges with that here in California and in Texas. And so I think we should be doing things that ensure that there is a supply of energy for the grid, and doing it in a way that reflects it, that we need to do it at a low cost way so it's affordable, but it's got to be reliable as well.
We've discussed some of the issues in this country that are important, that are making a lot of headlines. Is there anything that you or your colleagues are looking at that maybe aren't making all the headlines that we need to address as a nation? You mentioned stability of our power grid is a good example. Is there anything else that is on the horizon that you think we'll need to address as a country?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, so a good part of my time is spent focused on the national security threats. And, on certainly a weekly basis and sometimes a daily basis, we're reminded on the committee that the stability globally and the primacy of the United States and the primacy of our military forces, those are things we've taken for granted, and they're things we're losing. And when you look, we had, for example, the commander of Strategic Forces Command testify several weeks ago in front of the committee, and he talked about the progress that China is making in terms of modernizing its nuclear forces, and he said it's breathtaking. And so, we are now facing adversaries who are making advances in space, in cyber, AI, and in nuclear forces in ways that present a real threat to us. And I think it's important for the American people to recognize that our security and our prosperity and our freedom depends upon being able to deter adversaries. And that deterrence requires that our adversaries know we have the capability and we have the will. And that's the best way to ensure we don't have to use our military force. But weakness is really provocative, as we're seeing in Afghanistan today.
Are we getting behind in these areas in a dangerous way?
Yes, we are. Facing a situation where there are areas where we no longer have the advantage that we had before. I guess that's the best way to put it. And part of this is, and I particularly look at China in this regard. I think the Chinese government has recognized for many years and has been very determined to advance on multiple fronts against us. And I think both parties got China wrong. Both parties sort of said, we'll open up economically and they will open up politically. And that didn't happen because for a number of reasons, but at about the same time that they were opening up economically, the technology to conduct a global surveillance state, certainly, and certainly, a national surveillance state for them, became available. So we really do need to recognize the danger if China, for example, gets ahead of us in space, if China gets ahead of us on AI or on cyberspace. And we have to put the kind of determined, concerted effort into preventing that they are today putting into trying to accomplish that.
Congresswoman, is your concern regarding China from an economic standpoint or from a military standpoint?
Look, I think that they are a threat across the board because their view is that they must replace us. Their view is that their own
as
success,
the world leader.
Yeah. that that it's a zero-sum game. And so, and it's not just us. I mean, if you look at what the Chinese government has been doing, look at what they're doing with data. You know, there have been the news stories recently about some of the testing, for example, that pregnant women around the globe use, which has become clear that the company that produces those tests has connections to the Chinese military. So when you take those tests, or when you do 23andMe, or any, you know, that data goes right back into the Chinese government. And I think those kinds of things we have to be much more aware of, and recognize the vulnerability that poses.
You're on the Armed Services Committee. What keeps you up at night?
Well, I also have 5 kids. So
That may be even more of a,
right, exactly.
a
yeah.
worrisome issue.
Depending on the day. No, look, I mean, I think what keeps me up at night is I worry that the United States, that we have begun to take for granted how important our role in the world is. And we have had a series of presidents now, I would say beginning with Obama, who you know, didn't fundamentally recognize the danger of American withdrawal. And I think that, you know, we cannot get into a situation where we say, you know what, we don't have to worry about that, whatever the global issue is, because somebody else will take care of it. The lesson really has to be American strength, America being able to convey to our allies that they can count on us. American leadership in the world really matters. And I think that, you know, we're now in a situation, we've got the debt that is, you know, growing in ways that itself is a security threat. Allocation of funds, you know, it's spending too much, but the Defense Department budget is insufficient, and that keeps me up at night. That we will lose the ability to deter adversaries, and that an adversary will make a calculation that they can challenge us or they can threaten us, and that we will have lost our ability to deter it, and that makes conflict more likely.
On the flip side, what makes you sleep soundly at night about where we are as a country? Not the 5 kids, but
Yeah, no, well, sometimes they do too. But look, what makes me sleep soundly at night is that we're America, and that we have tremendous potential, that the ideas that are at the heart of our founding, the miracle of our founding, the miracle of our freedom, is incredibly powerful and important. And I will tell you specifically, in the time since my vote on impeachment and the months after that, one of the things that has been really tremendously moving and inspiring has been the reaction of young people. Young people across Wyoming, young people around the country, and young women especially, who have reached out to me, who've come to my events, who've come to talk to me to say, thank you, and we want to fight for our Constitution, and we want to fight with you. And it's not a partisan thing, but it is really moving and inspiring to see that reaction from our young people, and that gives me tremendous hope about the future.
on that subject from our audience, how do you keep going when your whole party seems to be against you? What motivates you to keep going?
I love this country. I believe in the values that we stand for. I've watched and worked in places around the world where authoritarianism took hold, where they don't have a peaceful transfer of power. And I know that I and, you know, all of us have a duty to stand up and to protect this unbelievable miracle, this jewel that we have. So that, to me, you know, that is the only thing that matters. And history will judge my colleagues who have put politics first, or who continue to embrace the former president, who continues to be an ongoing, you know, clear and present danger to this democracy. And people have an obligation to stand up against it.
And again, very strong words, and certainly a lot of Democrats believe that, but it's fascinating to hear from a Republican, as you are, to say that he is a danger to democracy. Did
He
you
is.
ever think that we would have a president who you would call dangerous to our way of life or our democracy?
I mean, I don't know that anybody could have imagined that we would be in this situation. I think a lot about the quote that's inscribed over the fireplace in the dining room in the White House, which I believe is John Adams, and it says, "May none but honest and wise men ever inhabit this house," and I think that is one of the real lessons of January 6th and of what we've lived through and we're still living through. It really matters. And this is a lesson for my colleagues. It really matters that you uphold your oath. You cannot look away from what happened. You can't look away. You can't say, well, you know what, it's more important to get reelected. Because the whole system, which was constructed by the framers, they required that we take an oath for a reason. And the system depends upon it.
Yeah, you mentioned the quote, honest man. What's the quote?
I think it's may none but honest and wise men. And of
Honest.
course, it should say women.
That's what I was going to ask.
We need to etch that in there.
Well, I was going to ask, maybe, will you etch that in at some point if you ever, will you
I'm
run
going
for
to
president?
appropriate funds to get that etched in.
Do you have an interest in running for president? Will you run for president?
Look, I am totally focused on doing everything that's necessary, obviously, to represent the people of Wyoming, and to help make sure that we prevent Donald Trump from being the Republican Party nominee, and ever getting anywhere close to the Oval Office again. It's
Do
that
you really
dangerous.
think he would run again? Or
I
is that
do.
just talk?
Yeah.
You think he might?
And I think that it is such a dangerous possibility, we have to assume it. And I think you can't ignore him. I think there are Republicans who say, well, just ignore him and he'll go away. But he is very much committed to, I think having power again. And I think it's important that we make sure that doesn't happen.
As a skilled politician, she didn't answer my question. As a skilled journalist, I'm going to ask it again. Well,
You're
do you think
noting
do you think you'll run for president? I mean, can you see? Would you be open to that? Let's phrase it that way.
It's not something that I'm announcing here in San Francisco.
We want to know. You're not going to let me break that story?
No, sorry.
For the sake of argument, let's assume you had an interest in running for president. Would it be, how hard would it be, given your stance and your being at odds with so many of your party? That would seem to be an incredible rock to push uphill.
I think that for the country, we have to have a Republican Party that is not captured by a cult of personality. And I think that's what's really important. I mean, we're going to have an election in 22. We'll have a presidential election in 24. The majority of my party is not captured by the cult of personality. But there are people who, and they've been deeply misled and betrayed by Donald Trump. And he's a man who, his idols are people like Vladimir Putin and Erdogan.
How do you explain that? How is that even possible?
Look, I again, I go back to what's etched over the fireplace in the White House, but it matters whether you elect people who are committed to the republic, and I think what we have seen is that wasn't his priority.
But so many people who support
And you are
him-
relentless.
It's what they pay me to do. But there's so many people, and I'd like to say well-meaning people, but so many people who have bought in
Yeah.
to what he stands for, and they to this day believe him, and they would
Right.
vote for him again. And they're
Look, and
passionate.
I think it's a really important point because he has been engaged in just such a fundamental betrayal of millions of really good, honest, hardworking people around this country. And, every single time, for example, you see a fundraising solicitation that he puts out that says, join me today to help me stop the steal, or join me, it's a fundamental betrayal. And he's taking people's money, and doing it in a way that is based on a lie. And I think that that's why it's so important for us to really be able to go back through and say, look, he did not win this election. And by the way, in addition to, the constitutional danger, he's a loser. And so if you look at, while he was president, the Republicans lost the House, the Senate, and then the White House. So in addition to the constitutional problems,
He was not good for the party.
embracing him, no. If you want to win elections, that's not the way to do it.
Last question we'll ask. How do you juggle being one of the most powerful people in Congress, living in Wyoming, living in Washington, being the only representative in Wyoming, which means you have to cover the entire state, raising 5 kids? There's a lot going on in your life.
This is a long conversation.
We're done. This is the last
yeah.
one. Yeah, how do you juggle all of that? And do you enjoy juggling all of that?
Yeah, look, I don't think that there's any sort of, clear answer. And I ask mothers this all the time, compare notes. I think that there's several things. I mean, one is being able to convey to your kids, and my parents conveyed to Mary and me, that no matter what else was happening, what's going on at home is the most important thing. And so, Phil and I try our best to do that. I also think, though, having grown up in the family that I grew up in and watching both my parents be engaged in causes that are bigger than them, and understanding their love of this country, and their love of history, those are all things that, I hope I can pass on to my kids. And look, they keep you totally, they really help you with your perspective. And I'll tell you one story.
Sure, please.
So this is a story from the 2004 presidential election. And we were on a bus ride across Michigan. And our second daughter, she was about 6 maybe, and or 5. And she was riding up in the front of the bus with my mom. So it was a big campaign bus going down the road. And not everybody in Michigan liked George Bush and Dick Cheney. I know it's a surprise, but not everybody did. And so we were rolling through a town, and there was a group of people, and one of the people flipped the bird at the bus. Yeah. And so my daughter, said, "Grandma, like, what's going on? What's happening? What's that person doing?" And my mom said, "Oh, sweetie, they're telling you they think you're number one." And but they definitely sort of keep you grounded,
Right.
and keep your perspective on things. And one final thing is, what's happened in the last 6 months, and talking about what's happened with my kids, and thinking about the possibility that, we all grew up in a place where we have a peaceful transfer of power, and we all know we could count on that. We took it for granted, and suddenly finding, looking at my sons, who are the youngest, they're still at home with us, and thinking, wow, are they going to grow up in a country where they can't count on that? And that I have to do everything possible to make sure that doesn't happen.
I will tell you one quick story. I covered, they sent me to cover President Trump's inauguration. And I remember I've covered almost everything you can in politics, but had not covered an inauguration. So I was glad to go see that and witness it. And I remember thinking, as I looked at the dais and watched the proceedings, I felt pride,
Yeah.
knowing that this was a man that a great many people, Americans and leaders, did not think should be president. But nonetheless, he won the election. And here we are, peacefully transferring power
Yeah.
to someone many people opposed. And I felt a sense of pride that as a country, we could do that. And you're right,
Very
to see what
important.
happened with this past election was disheartening.
Yeah. Yeah.
and can't be repeated.
No, we have to treasure and value what a special thing that is so much that we put it above politics.
What a great conversation. Congresswoman Liz Cheney.
Thank you. Thank you.
We also want to thank our audience, both here and online. So nice to be back in person with you, and thank you for joining us online. This program has been part of the Commonwealth Club's Future of Democracy series, and we've certainly discussed the future of democracy here today, supported by Betsy and Roy Eisenhart. My name is Dan Ashley from ABC 7 News and proud board member of the Commonwealth Club. This, one more time, please, for the Congresswoman.
Thank
Big
you.
hand.
Thank you. Very much.
This meeting of the Commonwealth Club is adjourned. Thank you all for being here.
Thank
What
you.
a pleasure.
Well,
That
thank you
was
so much.
great.
Great question.
Thank you. That was